Discretionary listener participation is advised for the following pro wrestling podcast.
I will say, and I will leave it alone. They are terrorists. He is a traitor. And hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, he will be gone. Hi, everyone. I'm John McAdam. Welcome to Stick to Wrestling, where if you give us 60 minutes, perhaps indeed, we'll give you a raw bone podcast. It is the only wicked good podcast out there. It is the People's Podcast. It is the Major League of Professional Wrestling Podcasts. Before I bring out my guest, who I'm really excited to have on, if you would like to follow me on Twitter, just put in the name John McAdam and follow the guy who has chair fighters in his avatar. I'm also, once again, inviting everyone to be part of our Facebook group. We talk wrestling. This week, I actually put up my top 20 favorite albums of 1976. So that's all right there for you. And with that, this show comes out on Friday, January 15th. 3 days later is the 50th anniversary of Ivan Koloff winning the WWF Championship from Bruno Sammartino. Then 3 weeks after that, Pedro Morales began his 3-year reign as WWF champion. My guest was present at Madison Square Garden for both of those title changes and more. I want to bring out John Jance. John, thank you for taking the time to be on Stick to Wrestling and sharing your mind with us.
Amen to your opening statement, John.
Thank you.
It's an honor for me to be making my debut on your wicked good raw bone People's Podcast, so I thank you.
You're very welcome. John, before I started peppering you with questions, please give us a little bit of your background as a wrestling fan. Like, how did it all get started?
Well, I've grown up in Queens, New York.
Where in Queens?
Flushing.
Oh, man, we were practically neighbors. I'm from Jackson Heights.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's 5 minutes away.
Yeah, oh, not even. I mean, I can get on the train and be at Shea Stadium literally in 5 minutes.
Oh, I know that. I'm a ticket holder.
Oh, there you go. I worshiped them growing up, but I'm out of that now.
Well, come back. We have Lindor.
Yes, what an awesome trade that was for you guys. You guys gave up nothing.
I mean, Jimenez, was like one of the highlights of the season, but no. We have Lindor. That's all that counts.
Yeah, well, and for those who don't know, Francisco Lindor is a fantastic shortstop, and the Mets got him. I mean, they didn't even give up quality prospects. But anyway, I got to start sticking to wrestling again. Oh, yeah. So you grew up in Flushing. When did you become a fan, and how?
Well, in the early '60s, Saturday night on WNEW, Wrestling from Washington with Ray Morgan would be televised.
Yes.
So occasionally I would see, I would watch it. I was like 6 or 7, and you'd see the beginnings of Bruno Sammartino. You'd see Antonino Rocca, Haystack Calhoun, and a variety of villains that most of them I've tended to forget. And then for some reason in the mid-'60s, they stopped televising it on WNEW, and it just disappeared. So, out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
Until one day in early 1969, I was playing chess with my neighbor, and he had a TV set on, and he had wrestling from Washington, D.C. This was a Wednesday afternoon. But every time the commercials came on, they were in Spanish. So I'm saying, what's this? They said, oh, this is UHF, which we didn't have on our outmoded black and white TV at home. So immediately, we would play chess every Wednesday as my pretense to watch wrestling. And so at that time, I felt I just got hooked on the characters, on Bruno, on just everything. Mostly the interviews seemed to intrigue me the most.
Oh, you and everyone else.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the highlight of the show. So when did you actually start attending matches? Like, was your first show at Madison Square Garden, or was it a spot show?
Yeah, no. Later that year, my father surprised me for my birthday with tickets to Madison Square Garden. This was the October 1969 show where Bruno fought Waldo Von Erich in a Texas death match. So, of course, I mean, it was like the greatest birthday present ever for me. And, to be able to see Bruno, to see him whip Waldo, and just to finally go to Madison Square Garden, because just saying Madison Square Garden was magical.
I mean, even me being from the Boston area, I mean, Madison Square Garden it's just a huge deal, whether it comes to wrestling or anything else.
Absolutely. You walk in there, smoke-filled, mostly men, middle-aged and older, but there was an aura around it, and so I was just excited.
Outstanding. So now, when did you start going regularly?
That was it. That was my first show, and I went every month. And I think there was only one show I missed in the next through the end of Morales' reign. I saw every one of Pedro's title matches. I saw all of Bruno's matches for his last year, his last 2 years, and I don't think I missed a show till about 1974.
I mean, you sound like me. Once I started going in 1981, I did not miss Boston Garden shows until I kind of waned off in 86. But there's one I missed because of a blizzard. I mean, what are you going to do? And I mean, it was just part of my monthly thing. I mean, I would literally be counting the days to the next time I would be able to see WWF wrestling in Boston, with Bob Backlund on top every time.
Oh, yeah. I was still going to Madison Square Garden through Billy Graham and Backlund, till about near the end of when Backlund started wearing the singlet. That's when I was sort of like, I'm kind of done with this. But I mean, consecutively from October '69, I think the first card I think I went every single show through 74, 75.
That is so great, man. I wish I had seen the things that you'd seen. And it's like everything else. I mean, I have gone to live wrestling, I mean, once in the last 20 years. No, like, I would say definitely once in the last 15 years. You just grow out of it,
Yes.
All right.
Especially the wrestling now, so.
Yeah, I mean, I like some of it today. I still watch like the monthly WWE specials. I'll watch the Royal Rumble in a few weeks, but it's changed so much. Not for the better, in my opinion.
I totally agree. I mean, McMahon Jr. is a genius, but the direction he took it has been a positive and it's been a negative. And in the last 10, 15 years, it's just not my cup of tea to watch. So.
No, I see where you're coming from, man. So, Ivan Koloff versus Bruno Sammartino, January 18th, 1971. You told me an interesting story a couple of days ago about a birthday party on that night. Can you share that with our audience?
Sure. January 18th is my father's birthday. And in all my life, in over 60 years, I always celebrated with him. Our family did, and I don't think I ever missed one single birthday for him except January 18th, 1971. So about a week before his birthday, I finally decided to ask him, and I said, is it okay if I'm not here for the party, a Monday night? I want to go to Madison Square Garden. So he looks at me, and he says, well, why? And you go every month. And I said to him, well, I think Bruno's going to lose the title that night. So he had a little grin on his face, and he nodded to me, and he says, well, for that reason. And then he nodded yes.
Now, I am absolutely fascinated by that because I have heard over the years that Bruno losing the title was an absolute shock to everyone, but you kind of saw it coming. Tell us about that. Okay.
I had been at the Garden show the month before, and Bruno had beaten Bulldog Brower for like the 1 millionth time, but he didn't pin him. And when they announced the following card, they said Ivan Koloff would be the next challenger in January. And I was thinking to myself, that's strange. Koloff just lost to Bruno the last time around, just earlier this year. So why would they bring him back this quickly.
Now, did he leave, or was it part of the same run?
In 1969, Koloff came in the winter, fought Bruno. In fact, it was practically exactly a year in 1970 that Bruno pinned him to blow off their series. And then Koloff appeared for a few more weeks until he left. So Koloff did leave the territory. I'd say about March or April of 1970. So here he was suddenly coming back like 6 months later. Something seemed strange. That was my first alarm. Nothing major, but it was just something. Then I started thinking, I said, well, the other thing that sort of led me there was that near the end when Koloff was returning at the end of 1970, he had a new manager. His original manager was a non-entity named Tony Angelo. But now he was back with Lou Albano. Now, Lou, I think his first protege was in June 1970 with the horrendous Crusher Verdú.
Oh.
I mean, I would rather watch a tree stump.
The pictures of Verdú were so impressive, and then I got to see him. I've had like 2 matches of his, and he is bad.
Oh my God, awful. And yet, Lou Albano became his voice, and suddenly from 14, 15, 16,000 people at each Garden show, they sold out twice. So Albano was now the manager of not only Ivan Koloff, but also the Mongols. So I said, that's interesting. I wonder why that would happen, besides the fact Tony Angelo sucked.
Yeah.
The other thing was also that Bruno during 1970, I thought, had a very weak schedule. He fought bums like Verdú, Crippler Karl Kovacs, Bulldog Brower. He also had, more runarounds with, they're not bums, Killer Kowalski and Professor Tanaka and George Steele. But we've seen that. We've seen that over and over. And in addition to that, Bruno was also fighting a lot of tag team matches with Victor Rivera against the Mongols. So I'm saying to myself, his schedule seems a lot weaker. His opponents are weaker. And in one of the previous matches at Madison Square Garden, when he faced Beppo Mongol, he fought Beppo twice. Beppo now Nikolai Volkov.
Right.
He fought him twice based on the fact that in their tag team match at the Garden, Beppo pinned Bruno for one of the falls. So that was, wow, Bruno got pinned. I know it's a tag match, but that was still earth-shattering in 1970. So things started clicking in my head that, well, you know what? It's almost 8 years. The day is going to come. And you know what? Ivan Koloff is a damn good wrestler. And if he was going to lose to anyone, I don't think anybody would quibble that it was Ivan Koloff. So those things were starting to happen. Now, 2 more things on top of that just cemented it for me. And one was his interviews. His interviews on TV, especially with Ray Morgan, were becoming a lot more introspective. Like, tell us about your career, your favorite hold, what it's been like to be champ for so long. And Bruno seemed very wistful and very reflective, which he often was. I mean, people don't give him the credit he deserves as being really one of the best interviews in all of wrestling history. The guy was dynamite. I mean, I know by our standards now, it's not the same, but you don't carry the WWF and gain that respect and that popularity with the fake act. And with Bruno, it was all genuine and sincere with him. So those interviews were telling me, you know what, this is getting fishy. But finally, the icing on the cake was the return of Pedro Morales. Now, he started making appearances. He was back here as the U.S. champ, and it was announced that he would fight this piece of crap named Willie the Wolfman Farkas on January 18th at the Garden as the semi-main event. So adding all those ingredients together, I was normally I would have said, Dad, I'm there for your birthday. Putting all these together, I had to ask his permission to go. And thankfully, he granted it to me because the rest is history.
Now, how long had Pedro been out of the WWF before his return in 1970?
That I can't really tell you. It would have had to be before 1968. I do remember Pedro Morales at some point about 65, I believe, before it went off the air in New York City, off of the local channels, before it went to the Spanish channel.
Right.
So I can't really tell you when Pedro left.
Oh, that's okay. So you're in Madison Square Garden, January 18th, 1971. Can you tell us how this historic match unfolded before you?
Well, no different from any other Bruno match. Koloff was just a great opponent. They had great chemistry together, and it seemed to me that, it was just their typical match. I didn't see anything unusual about it. Koloff and Bruno fought their usual styles, and it was, what's the word, undistinguished from any of their past matches until the end.
And what was the finish? I mean, some of us have seen it on tape. I've seen it on tape, but for those who haven't.
I only watched it as a side note. I only watched it on tape once, and I should have watched it with the sound off because that commentary and the commentary sucked, and obviously the ending to have crowd noises was obviously wrong. But here goes. The ending was pretty much as I remembered it. Bruno whipped Koloff into the ropes. This was after about 15 minutes or so. And again, it was their average great match. Whips him in the ropes and charges into the ropes. Koloff puts his foot out, kicks him down. Bruno lands on the mat. Koloff then climbs up the ring post to do his leg drop. Now, we've seen this a million times, and the crowd is, going wild, because we're expecting Bruno's going to get up, as he did a million times before. But as I'm watching it, it just seemed to me, and there's some sort of a psychological term for it, but it seemed that Koloff was climbing up and going and flying off the ring post in slow motion. To me, it was just happening in slow motion. And he hits Bruno, I believe it was across the chest, and then goes for the count. And the referee goes, and the crowd is still roaring, and the ref's going 1, 2, no kick out. 1, 2, 3. Dead silence. The bell rings. I'm getting chills thinking about this moment. And silence in the garden. The crowd, half the crowd just stands on their feet. The other half is just like, what? But again, for a good 30 seconds or so, I'd say there was silence. Then I start hearing some sobbing. And you just look around and you see people were genuinely stunned, as I was, because it's still, Bruno was just pinned. Even though I sort of expected it, you know what I mean? It's just like it happened.
Yep.
The unbelievable happened. So the ring announcer, who I believe was the legendary Johnny Addy at the time, the boxing ring announcer, also did the Garden. And he says the time, 15 minutes, so-and-so seconds, and the winner, Ivan Koloff. That's it. Didn't say new champion. He said the winner, Ivan Koloff. There was a smattering of boos, not much, not what you would anticipate, but there was some booings, and absolutely no one was heading to the ring for a riot. There were no police surrounding the ring for a riot. Nobody was going to riot. Everybody was stunned. They were just too stunned, and they got Koloff out of the ring pretty quickly, without the belt, obviously. And Skolin comes in to console Bruno, and I just remember as Bruno was getting up to leave, he got a huge ovation. it was just like really strong, really sincere. It wasn't the kind of that you see at most sports events. I'd say it was an ovation of appreciation that he got. And it was that type. And he left, and that was it. That was what I recall.
Was that the last match of the night?
Oh, no. Because Bruno's matches were usually in the middle of the card, and that way you'd have one or two matches, and then the highlight for many of the night was when they would announce the next card.
Right.
And at that point, at the next, when Johnny Addy said, and here's the lineup for February, 3 weeks from now, the main event would be the new WWF champion, Ivan Koloff, and not much of a crowd reaction, the usual boos, but not more so than you'd think, against, the United States champion, Pedro Morales. Boom. Lid off the garden.
Okay, because, usually the championship match was not last anywhere in the Northeast, to be honest with you, but I just wanted to check on that. Now,
the only times that it would be the last is if it would be up against the 11 o'clock curfew, like Morales versus Stasiak would be, or Bruno versus Steele. So those were the only times. If the championship match was last, it was going to curfew.
Okay, that totally makes sense. Now, if I'm sitting in that crowd and they announce that it's not going to be a Bruno versus Koloff rematch the next month, and it's Pedro Morales, I would start to get a little suspicious that the title's going to change hands again in 3 weeks. Were you kind of in that boat?
I was convinced. I already pretty much knew it because in my imagination, before seeing the Bruno Koloff match, I just said, you know what? Bruno's going to lose. Morales will take over after that. I didn't think it would be that quick, but sure enough, as soon as they announced it, I knew that the title's going to change again in 3 weeks.
Now, let me ask you this. What was the television like the next week? Did they announce it right away, or did they, what was the announcement like? I guess I should be asking.
Here's one of my regrets. I used to audio tape on reel-to-reel the interviews from 1969 on, which I had put away in a garage attic, which unfortunately had a leak in the roof.
Oh, man.
Which destroyed all my audio tapes, my reel-to-reels from all that time, because they would get wet, they would freeze in the wintertime, they became brittle. The interviews. No, the interviews mostly focused on Morales versus Koloff. There was and that Bruno would be returning to face, I believe, Guido Mongol in the semi-main event. So I don't recall. No, there weren't really any interviews with Bruno about the loss. They just moved ahead that Koloff was facing Pedro. There was no retrospect on Bruno.
Okay, which in a way makes sense. In order to get Pedro over as the new champion, which is, obviously very important, you can't spend too much time reminiscing on Bruno.
Exactly, and you only had 3 weeks to do it.
Right, so now we're moving on to February the 8th, 1971. Main event is Pedro Morales against Ivan Koloff. I know you suspected that the title was going to change hands. What was the atmosphere like in Madison Square Garden? Did everyone kind of see this coming?
Yes. Yes. I think they were just excited that Pedro Morales was back and that he would be avenging Bruno and going against Koloff. I don't think there was anyone there that didn't expect the title to change hands.
Okay, and which totally makes sense in my opinion. Now, what do you remember about that match, Pedro Morales versus Ivan Koloff? I don't think I've seen that one.
Koloff seemed different. He didn't approach Pedro the way that he did with Bruno. He didn't come at him. He was showing a lot of respect to Pedro and wasn't as on the offense as usual. Now, at that point, I was not a Pedro Morales fan in this incarnation. He was not as fast. He was not as flashy as I had barely remembered and as his reputation had done. he would do a high spot and then 5 minutes of a headlock or some sort of rest hold. He did a lot of stalling. He would throw a lot of punches, but very little in the way of wrestling. However, Koloff was just not on the offense like he usually is. And to me, it just didn't seem like much of a match. Honestly, if I could have had a replacement for Bruno, it would have been Victor Rivera. I think Victor Rivera, I would have been thrilled if he had been the next champ, and I would love, I don't know who could ever tell us why Rivera was not considered as the replacement and that they brought in Morales, if you're going to appeal to the Spanish audience, because Victor had more than proven himself over the last 2 or so years, and as far as I know, had never been pinned in Madison Square Garden. So I wasn't a Morales fan, and I just didn't think it was much of a match.
Now, we spoke a few days ago before you came on, and I had never even imagined, it was a little bit before my time, but I knew Victor Rivera was a big star. I know he had main events and tag team matches with Bruno Sammartino at Madison Square Garden. I mean, my mind was kind of blown when you rolled that out there a few days ago that you thought Victor Rivera would have, in fact, been a better WWF champion than Pedro Morales.
I'm convinced at that time that he would have been. I think maybe perhaps that he had been around for too long and that they needed someone like Morales to come back, maybe nostalgia or something would propel him. As I said, I don't ever remember Rivera losing matches, and he was a high flyer. He had great moves. He was the guy who would, finish off Bruno's opponents after, they went through the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, he was like the number 2 babyface in the territory and had been so for a long time. So I thought he was deserving. I sort of resented that Morales, who lost several steps in his repertoire, was back. But he was a name, he was established, he was remembered, he was very popular, as you could see, from his drawing power over the next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, would you regard his 3-year run generally as a success?
That is a great question. It was a success in Madison Square Garden. There's no denying the numbers that he drew month after month. He was freaking selling out the Garden, no matter who he wrestled. But it was the same match. It was the same interviews. It was the same match. It was the same style. He was getting slower and slower. One thing about Pedro, which I admired, was he sold the crap for his opponent. That I respect him for. He really let his opponent get their best offense in, no matter whether it was Curtis Iakia or Stan Stasiak or anyone else. Especially, I remember Don Leo Jonathan was just like wiping the floor with him the whole match. And then the last 30 seconds, Pedro flies off the top ropes and wins out of nowhere after getting shellacked for 15 minutes. So Pedro's selling, I thought, was exceptional. His drawing power in New York was fine, but he wasn't drawing, as far as I remember, anywhere else.
I have heard that he did relatively well in Philadelphia, but was kind of a bomb everywhere else. Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Boston, etc.
I heard the same thing.
And I mean, I asked you, would you regard him as a success as champion? And, I already kind of knew the answer. I mean, Vince McMahon Jr. gave Bruno just an unbelievable deal to come back. I think he got 10% of the gross, and he got a reduced schedule. I mean, the legend has it that Sam Muchnick called Vince Sr. and yelled at him because of the deal he gave Bruno that was better than what the NWA champion was getting.
And the NWA champion was the champion, and when you base it on the quality of opponents and the work rate, the work schedule that they had, oh my God.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I always knew. Look, I love the old WWF, but I mean, it was north to Portland, south to Washington, west to Pittsburgh, and everything else was the NWA.
Oh, the NWA champion was the world's heavyweight champion. But Bruno was Bruno.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just the way it was.
I mean, Bruno was still drawing in Boston in this weird feud they had against Roddy Piper in 85 and 86 and Randy Savage in 86. I don't think anyone else could have pulled that off.
No, you're right.
I mean, he was just the legend. He didn't get pushed on TV or anything like that, but he was Bruno Sammartino. End of story.
I mean, even after he lost the title the second time, look at the series with Zbyszko. Look at the fact he headlined at Shea Stadium 3 times. I mean, they weren't sellouts, but he still headlined. And Morales did too. The Morales-Bruno match was also at Shea. So I give, Morales gets credit for being able to draw in New York, but as you said, not really that well in most other cities. So I can understand McMahon making the deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, Pedro drew well in New York, drew pretty well in Philly. Bruno drew in Boston, in Philly, and everywhere else.
There was a little arena not far from Jackson Heights called Sunnyside Garden.
I had family in Sunnyside.
Ah, there you go. It was a little old-fashioned boxing arena, and the big thing was that twice a year Bruno would wrestle there against a B-level villain, but Bruno would be there. And it was always sold out, like, within a day or two. If you didn't get your ticket the first day it was on sale, forget it. With Morales, I went there once for one of his matches against Buddy Wolf, and let's say there were empty seats.
Wow.
Not many, but still, it wasn't a Bruno crowd.
And I get that because I grew up literally down the road from a place called Jack Witchy Sports Arena that had WWF wrestling every Friday night. And, it didn't always sell out, but if Superstar Billy Graham was defending the title there, which I think he did twice, you better get your tickets the day they go on sale. If Andre's there, it's going to sell out.
Yes, you would generally know who sells out.
Yeah. Hey, were you at the Bruno versus Pedro Shea Stadium match?
Yes. Sorry to say.
You've already answered my question, but can you tell us a little bit about first the build-up to that match and then the match itself?
The build-up, I thought, was really very well done, where I forgot who they were facing in the tag team match. It may have been Tanaka and Fuji, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. Where they had the split up. Now, the thing I found interesting in that was that they were making Bruno to be a very subtle heel. I can't explain it. Bruno obviously was not a heel, but you know what?
He was being a little bit more aggressive than usual, maybe?
No. It was it was something about just the style of the interview. You would say to yourself, look, if these two were such friends, why don't they just, talk it out instead of having to fight? There was some sort of aura over the whole thing that sort of cast him as the bad guy because, of course, Pedro could not lose. That's one thing. That with many of the crowd that would go to Madison Square Garden, it didn't matter who Pedro was facing. The other person was the heel.
Right. So they're having this giant match at Shea Stadium. And by the way, I'm not aware of any Pedro versus Bruno matches anywhere else. I should have looked that up before we started. But please tell us about that match. And that match is legendary for all of the wrong reasons. You went to Shea Stadium, you saw it. Please tell us about it.
It lived up to its reputation. It really was a disappointment. Now, the match started with great anticipation. Everybody was all excited in the first few minutes, like most Pedro Morales matches. Pedro worked. Bruno always worked. And it was exciting. And I think at about the 10-minute mark, it just became a series of rest holds. It would be arm locks on the mat. It would be headlocks on the mat. And you could just see, especially when it was about 10 o'clock or so, 10 after 10, I saw on this, and I just said to myself, wait, they've had all the other matches. Is it possible they're actually going to go to the draw? Because you knew there was no way Pedro was going to lose. And there was no way Bruno was going to lose. So I just did not imagine that it would go to the curfew draw. I just could not see either of them winning that match.
There are some matches where you just, you can't have a finish, so you got to fall back on the draw.
That's basically it. So they had to do whatever they could to make sure both of them could last 70, 75 minutes. Now, there was one moment, I believe, where George Steele ran out to the ring to cause a commotion.
Yes.
He ran out from the dugout and ran over and was outside for about 3-4 minutes, which gave both of them a well-needed little break in the middle of the match.
So the match is every bit as bad as its reputation.
I'm sorry to say, yes. The build-up was phenomenal, but, when you're adding the fact, I believe it was September, it was a very chilly Saturday night.
That's what I heard.
And it did not live up to what everybody expected. We wanted to see more. But again, Pedro was very limited even at that point in what he could do in the ring.
I'm just wondering what the WWF was thinking, because they're booking a show on a Saturday night late in September, and it not only does it tend to get cold in New York, but I mean, Shea Stadium, I don't know why, it's like the coldest place on earth.
Absolutely. The wind just coming in from Flushing Bay just goes right through you, and that night it was. And I'm trying to remember if it had been drizzling that night also. For some reason, I have a feeling that there may have been some drizzle.
Oh, great. So not only is it really cold, it was really damp.
That's my distant memory.
Okay, no, it's been 50, been almost 50 years, so that's quite all right. Now, after the match was over, like, did they shake hands and hug, and
yes.
Were they okay?
Absolutely, like they were the best of friends. The crowd went home happy, and they were definitely friends. There was even at the beginning of the match, I believe that they did shake hands at the beginning of the match. They fought each other. They wrestled. There were a couple times where you would get the setup where someone would be in the ropes and you'd wonder, is he going to throw a punch at them? But neither did. Neither of them broke any rules. You would see that, Pedro would get agitated every now and then. Bruno would get angry a little now and then, but they never broke any rules. Big hug. Just like when Pedro beat Koloff at the end of that match, Bruno runs into the ring, and now the Garden was already going insane over Pedro winning, but then when Bruno comes in to give him the belt, I mean, now the roof was off. So they were friends again.
I am so glad you brought that up. That's in my notes to bring up, and I didn't bring it up, and we kind of passed by it, but now we're back. To me, that was one of the smartest things a wrestling promotion can ever do, and that is have the legend Bruno endorse Pedro Morales as the new WWWF champion.
That's correct. It was a brilliant move, and it worked.
Now, I'm not sure if you were watching wrestling in 1990. The Ultimate Warrior beat Hulk Hogan at the Sky Dome in Toronto and became the new WWF champion. And they tried to play it as like Warrior was not the number one baby face. It was like kind of a tie with Hogan 1 and 1A. And I have always said that is one big reason why Ultimate Warrior did not get over the way I felt he should have as WWF champion. When the torch was finally passed, did Bruno kind of step aside / step away, or they just, if I recall correctly, they kind of got Bruno out of the way?
Well, Bruno was there that night to fight Guido Mongol as the co-main event, and that was February. He didn't come back till about July, I believe, where he beat Blackjack Mulligan in about a minute. So, yeah, at that point, Bruno was gone. He wasn't on TV. He was just basically retired. And nobody bore any grudge about that because for 8 years, he represented. So he deserved the break.
From what I have read, he desperately wanted a break. And they did the same thing when Bob Backlund became champion. Bruno kind of went away for a few months.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that point, I mean, of course, Bruno had to fight Graham in a couple rematches, but after the Hansen match, he was pretty much finished.
Oh, from what I understand, after the Hansen match, Bruno absolutely wanted out. And to think he was still around 10 years later, but because they needed him.
Could you imagine? I mean, just try to imagine that he was back doing a cage match and then doing the match at Shea Stadium like that summer.
Yeah.
Against Hansen.
That was not very long at all after he sustained the injury. I mean, I know Bruno has complained that they rushed him back, that Vince Sr. had told him that, hey, he's on the phone begging him, I'm going to lose my business. I'm going to go under. And Bruno's sitting there with his neck broken, for God's sake.
Well, at that time, remember, you had the Ali Inoki match, so Vince Sr. obviously saw, well, if we tie that up with Bruno's return versus Hansen, this is money in the bank, and we could get Shea Stadium. So to McMahon, it made perfect sense. But as far as Bruno's concerned, I sure hope he got a lot of money for that.
Same here. Did you go to that show?
No, I was actually, this is kind of unusual. I was actually in, of all places on earth, Albania, and I was flying back that night.
Oh, man.
From Albania. But believe it or not, in Albania, which back then was under real communist oppression, everybody knew who Muhammad Ali was, and they whispered to me, who do you think's going to win, Ali or the wrestler?
That's funny.
It was always the wrestler. But they even there where news from the outside world was heavily censored, everybody knew that fight was happening. No, that night I was coming home. So otherwise I would have gone.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, you've seen so much cool stuff. Another thing I want you to share with the audience, Pedro's reign comes to an end on December the 1st, 1973. Stan Stasiak beat Pedro Morales, and then right afterwards, Bruno Sammartino takes the belt from Stasiak. Were you there the night that Stan Stasiak won the title?
Yes. I think the month before, I believe Pedro was defending the title. I think it was against Larry Hennig. Not positive. But at the end of the night, they announced, and next month, December 8th or whatever it was, the main event will be Pedro Morales defending the title against Larry Hennig in Texas Deathmatch, I believe, with the appropriate pauses to build up excitement. And Stan the Man Stasiak will be in the semi-main event against, and then, of course, Bruno Sammartino. Now, I'm ready to buy the ticket because Bruno's back and against one of Pedro's better opponents. So I said, this will be good. We didn't know, I believe it was I think it was a week before on Saturday night, the first Saturday of December, where it was announced on Allentown TV, I believe, that Stasiak had beaten Pedro. And that was our first, there was no film, no tape. They didn't give any description. They just said Stasiak had won the title. And the interview announcements all said, well, now Bruno will be challenging for the title. And that's how it came across, which was the smart move to do it the way they did because they didn't have any riot.
Oh, yeah.
They were to announce that Pedro lost. Because, in the 2+ years that Pedro held the title at the Garden, he never lost a match. Not even by decision, not even by countout, not even by blood. Now, I know there's a result on a website that I very much respect, which on one of the Stasiak matches, they had that he lost. No way. No way. If you told that crowd that Pedro Morales lost the match, you would have had trouble. Just like the night when Pedro won the title, that ring was surrounded by cops immediately. The crowd wasn't going to riot, but they were in a real happy frenzy.
Yeah.
If Pedro lost the match, no.
And I don't doubt for a minute anything you're telling us because I used to, we talked about this, in the early 80s, I would go to the Boston Garden, and it could be a dangerous place. And that's just the way the Northeast was, whether it be New York, Philly, Madison Square Garden. I mean, the wrestling night was always crazy.
Oh, yeah. Usually, even in the Garden on undercards, There would be occasional matches where the crowd would really be getting rowdy and very excited, but it was still the Garden, so there seemed to be a little bit more of a, keep things in line code because we're in the Garden. In the Garden, you behave somewhat. You could be emotional, but this is still the Garden. It was that kind of thing. But not with Pedro. Pedro, no, he didn't lose. So I think the move to switch it the way they did it was very smart.
And it's funny because history repeats itself. I mean, that's pretty much, it's very similar to the way they moved the title from Backlund to Iron Sheik to Hulk Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you see, was there any kind of a buildup for Bruno returning as champion or Bruno winning the title on that night?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. He wasn't doing any TV matches. The only interviews he was doing was, it's a pleasure to be returning to Madison Square Garden and my home and facing a very tough opponent. And Bruno was his usual respectful interview. Nothing prior to the announcement that Stasiak was the champ. Nothing would have tipped you off that this was going to happen. It was just Bruno doing his twice-a-year appearance at the Garden. That's all.
Then when you learned that Pedro had lost the title to Stasiak and that Bruno versus Stasiak it was now for the title, how much did you suspect that the title was going to change hands again?
Oh, who didn't? Who didn't? Absolutely convinced. I mean, if Pedro was out of the way, just that Stasiak would be the interim champ pretty much like Koloff was, only he'd be champ for 8 or 9 days. I would have bet the house on it. Yeah,
I mean, no disrespect to Stan Stasiak, who, matter of fact, I'm asking someone who would know. I mean, Stan Stasiak was actually pretty good in the early 70s, so I heard.
Stan Stasiak, I would say, may have been Pedro's best all-around opponent. He fought Pedro many times. He always gave him they just had styles that matched. They had styles that worked against each other. So I've always felt that Stasiak, for his longevity against Pedro, he fought him 2 or 3 times over the years, and I would put him at the very top.
No, that is a very interesting viewpoint.
Yeah, so when the word, I mean, as far as an actual Garden match, I think Don Leo Jonathan just destroyed Pedro twice. I mean, that Don Leo Jonathan was absolutely the best wrestler I saw Pedro wrestle. I mean, hands down. But he was only in for the series against Pedro, pretty much. He wasn't really around the circuit too long. But for someone around the circuit, definitely Stasiak, I consider the top guy.
That's interesting because I always looked at it as, I always try to put myself in the mindset of someone who was around during that time period. And, I think I would have figured out that Bruno was winning the title. And part of the reason would have been, I just can't see Stan Stasiak having any kind of a real run with the WWF title.
Oh, no, absolutely. Going into it, when it was first announced Bruno was going to fight Stasiak, the only reason to get the ticket was, wow, Bruno's going to beat him, and, it's good to see Bruno back.
Yeah.
We didn't know at the time that Pedro was going to lose to Stasiak, so it was only announced, as I said, about a week before the actual match. So there were 2 Saturday tapings that we saw with interviews, but prior to those 2 tapings, it was just a usual Bruno Stasiak match. But no, anybody with any idea about the scene knew that Stasiak was not going to keep it, especially when he was fighting Bruno at Madison Square Garden. Are you kidding? I would love to find someone who was willing to bet on that.
It's funny. Like I'm having this conversation with you, and we all knew that wrestling was a work. Everyone, like, if you're going to Madison Square Garden, even, paying for tickets, whatever, my friends and I, we always kind of just turned our brains off and just say, okay, we're going to pretend this is not a work and we're going to enjoy it. But at the same time, I mean, you and I did the same thing. Like, you put together the clues on Ivan Koloff's going to win the title, not in an athletic contest, but something that is laid out.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right.
All right. We're running out of time, and I've got I got more important things to ask you about. You were present at Madison Square Garden when Bob Backlund beat superstar Billy Graham for the WWF title. Can you tell me a little bit about the build-up to that and what that match was like and what Madison Square Garden was like on that night?
Well, the build-up for Backlund done by Senior was just absolutely fantastic. If you're going to give Senior credit for anything, he took Backlund. Now, of course, the New York area, the WWF was built on ethnic baby faces being on top usually. But at that time, Bruno wanted out. I am in the camp that says Billy Graham should have stayed longer. I think he should have turned into a, baby face. And he could have gotten another year or so out of him. However, I think, McMahon found Backlund and took this very different type of good guy. Tony Garea and guys like that never cut the mustard. But Backlund had the skill, had reputation. The guy was tough. He was strong. He knew his moves. And yeah, his interviews sucked, but he was the ultimate good guy. So I think taking him, introducing him to this area, feeding him to all the enhancement talent, shall we say, and building him up very methodically over the next almost a year.
It was a little more than a year.
Yeah, over a year. No, I saw that pretty much coming soon, not too long after Graham won the title. I didn't think Graham would lose it quickly. I thought that they would keep it on him for a few months till Backlund got East Coast seasoning.
Yeah.
And it was almost a year, I believe. So by the time Backlund was set for the match, it was a go. Again, another show where it was electric because you had a lot of Billy Graham fans.
Yeah.
Which should be noted that there were a lot of people who were cheering for Billy Graham. Not so much in Madison Square Garden, but in other arenas, as far as I've heard. So again, when Backlund finally faced off with him, I had no doubt that Backlund was going to win the title. And be the next long-reigning champion.
Now, a couple of things they did to build this up. They had, I'm sure you were there, an 8-man elimination tag team match. And I forget exactly who was in it, but it was Bob. At the end of the day, the 3 baby faces got eliminated. It was Bob Backlund against 4 of the top heels, and Bob prevailed. Were you there for that?
If it was at the Garden, I believe I saw all of Billy Graham's matches defending the title against Mascaras and Maivia and Dusty and whoever else he faced, Monsoon, I believe. So I must have seen it, but I don't really have a big memory of it. I do remember, but I don't know who he wrestled. That definitely got him over with the Garden crowd. Definitely.
Yeah. It wasn't against like main eventers, to say the very least. I think it was like Tanaka Fuji, Baron Mikel Cicluna, and Stan Stasiak. That's my best guess. And this was Stasiak at the end.
Yeah, that's probably who it was.
And then I believe it was the next month, they had the Mil Mascaras versus superstar Billy Graham match in January 1978. Yes. And the Grand Wizard of Wrestling was not leaving ringside, which, A, was unusual, and B, he's not exactly a threat. And Mascaras went to the back and got Bob Backlund out to even the sides.
Mm-hmm. Because back in those days, the managers weren't allowed to stay at ringside, except for Skoland.
Right.
Usually the triumvirate would, come out, make some noise, and then go back. So when they announced that Backlund would be fighting Graham the following month, even though Graham did not get a clean win over Mascaras because nobody ever did.
Yep.
Instead of, wasting time on a third match, which would produce the same result, it was time for Backlund. Yes. So when it was announced, the place exploded.
All right. Because I have heard over the years that, once again, everyone knew that Bob Backlund was going to win the title on February 20th, 1978.
Without a doubt. He had gotten, as I said, with much credit to Vince Sr., a really wonderful, well-developed build-up.
Yeah, I mean, I was in sixth, or I was in seventh grade when Backlund won the title, and the After magazines, which we talked a little bit about off the air, dropped every hint known to man that Bob Backlund was eventually going to win the title, and I did not pick up on them. I mean, did you? I know we had our little yak on the After mags, but it was all we had. I mean, did you pick up on it?
At that point, I wasn't reading the After mags because me and Dave Meltzer had been in regular weekly contact, so there was no need to follow After mags at that point.
Okay, this is 77
himself.
Wow, this is like way back in like 77, 78.
Yeah, Dave and I have been corresponding since December 1971. That's the whole story.
Okay, wow. So you're right. You definitely don't need the After mags the way I did.
About 2 or 3 years later, I just gave up on reading them. I said,
that's
what am
fantastic.
I wasting money for?
Yeah, I mean, I got misinformation. You got good information. I'm very jealous.
That's a good way to put it.
All right. Well, here's one thing I wanted to ask you about. We're going into overtime here, so I need to know about this. December 26, 1983, after Bob Backlund has been WWF champion for almost 6 years, the bomb drops. Iron Sheik, completely unexpectedly, to me anyway, wins the WWF title. John, you were at Madison Square Garden. Can you tell me what that night was like?
Absolutely unexpected, even with the angle with the Persian clubs, which we had seen the Saturday night before. Actually, I was there, but I wasn't there. I was outside the Felt Forum with some friends, and we were debating, should we, get tickets to see this? And one of my friends said to me, who's Backlund facing? They said, the Iron Sheik. Says, nah, he ain't going to win. And we all nodded and went off to some arcade playing pinball. I did not see it, but I was at the Garden for a few minutes. That was also unexpected. Yeah, sure, we were fed up and tired of Backlund. We wanted to see him lose, but Backlund had already beaten the Sheik around the horn about 2 or so years previously, and he just wasn't being given any kind of a build-up to be that much of a threat. So, no, I didn't see that coming. I don't think anybody saw that coming, except far away in San Jose, California. One person knew what was happening, because when I called Dave the next morning to tell him what had gone, the next morning when I read about it in the paper, he told me that, well, I've got more news for you. He said, Hulk Hogan has just been signed. So at that point, then I realized what was happening.
I mean, it all comes together. I mean, I can tell you my experience. I had just gotten home from a trip to Montreal, and one of my friends calls me right away, and he's like, Bob Backlund lost the title. I'm like, get out of here. And he's like, guess to who? And I guessed everyone on the planet. I mean, I get Sergeant Slaughter, Morocco, who had been there for a long time, Orndorff, Mass Superstar. And he kept going, nope. And then I start repeating. So Sergeant Slaughter, Mass Superstar. And finally he says Iron Sheik. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, we did a whole show on this maybe 2 years ago on what led to the decision to put the title on the Iron Sheik. It was this simple. I mean, they signed Hogan, and they were taking the belt off Bob Backlund on his very next Madison Square Garden match, regardless of who it was.
That absolutely makes total sense. It really does. Because even when they announced that Iron Sheik would be facing Backlund again, it was like, well, why? Why is he That's why, I wasn't so enthusiastic about going to the show, because we all saw that already. And the first match they had was a great match, don't get me wrong. But I didn't want to see it again. For what purpose? And we were tired of Backlund at that point.
Yeah.
We wanted him to lose, but Iron Sheik wasn't going to beat him. And as it turned out, it was a very well done match. It was, a friend of mine taped it for me off of their cable, and I was able to watch the whole thing like that weekend, and it was a very well done match. But no, total surprise.
No, I was.
And in fact, they had announced, if I recall, they definitely announced at the Garden that Backlund would be getting a rematch with Iron Sheik at the January card.
Mm-hmm.
I know that happened. I'm not sure if they announced that on the first tapings afterwards. Actually, they may have. That I can't remember.
No, what they did in New York was they announced Bob Backlund versus Iron Sheik rematch, and then I want to say a week before, like the Saturday before, or maybe like the Saturday 9 days before, they announced that Bob Backlund was just his shoulder had not recovered, he couldn't wrestle, and Hulk Hogan was going to take his place. And
yes, I believe you're right. Yes, it would have been a week or two before. Yes.
Now, what was your reaction to Hulk Hogan winning the title so quickly?
Well, we've seen that movie too. He was going to be the next long-term champ, but I had no idea that what would happen, the direction the WWF would take. I had seen Hogan when he went around the horn with Backlund and with Andre previously, so I wasn't impressed, but I was impressed, obviously, now that he adopted his Thunder Lips portrayal in Rocky III, and he took on that type of persona. I knew it would be different, but somehow, I don't know, that wasn't really my cup of tea. But I did think he would be the next long-term champ, but I had no idea the direction it would take.
I mean, for me, it was like two huge surprises. I mean, earth-shaking surprises 4 weeks apart because, I figured Hulk Hogan would get some sort of a build-up before they put the title on him. I mean, I was even thinking, Hogan's going to win the title. I'm just like, wow, he's here. Let's see what happens next. And before I even know it, he's the new champion.
Yeah, well, it's pretty much like, in a way, Pedro only had like a very short build-up till he would get the shot, and Bruno coming back out of nowhere. So it just seemed to be the same pattern of the interim heel and the long-term champ.
Yeah, I mean, the WWF in 1984, I mean, you know it like I know it. I mean, the era that we grew up in with, Bruno Sammartino, Superstar Billy Graham, Bob Backlund. I mean, by the time we hit, July the 4th, like that world was gone.
Absolutely.
Which is sad. And like I said, I know, a lot of people, a lot of our listeners grew up in the Hogan era, and that's what they enjoyed, and that's fine. That's cool. It's just, for us, it was like, oh man, this, this thing that we once had is sadly gone.
Oh yeah. You could never reclaim that, but I mean, I did go to several of Hogan's matches at the Garden. I mean, they were interesting for what they were, but for me, jumping the shark came with the Ultimate Warrior, and to be honest, around that point, I mean, a guy who was already gassed by the time he ran to the ring and would only give you a 1 or 2 minute match, and a mediocre one at best, as your champ, I was pretty much done with watching it consistently at that point. I lost a lot of interest.
I lost a lot of interest. Right, 92. I was a year behind you when they, the promotion just looked old and terrible and didn't feel like it had any star power left. And they were doing Papa Shango and Doink the Clown. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I'm sorry to be repetitive. John, I could talk all day with you because you have so many interesting stories to share. And I mean, thank you for coming on. Thank you for letting me sit under your learning tree for an hour.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share this. I mean, for all your many listeners to have some sort of idea about what it was like in the prehistoric days of WWF. And I thank you for your great podcast. And again, for letting me reminisce. It was a real pleasure.
And we'll definitely do this again in the not too distant future because I still have a million questions for you.
I'm ready.
All right. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for listening. Hopefully we will get through this week. I want to thank Lightning Lou Kippelman for doing a great job producing this podcast. This is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Network. We'll see you next week, everyone. Stay safe.
This concludes our podcast day.